Hell is other people. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote this phrase not to provoke hatred, but to reveal how much the other defines us, pressures us, and unveils us. Now imagine, what happens when that other, who has the power to define us by their gaze, simply ignores you? You try to make contact, you cast words, you offer your presence, but silence is the only answer. Absence, the void, nothingness. And then the question arises, is this indifference a sign of strength, of emotional superiority, of detachment? Or could it be that behind this gesture hides a deeper weakness? A weakness that is not only personal, but existential. In this video, we will cross the mirror of silence, understand why someone chooses to ignore the other, and more importantly, what this gesture reveals about the one who practices it. Because ignoring is not a neutral act. It is a choice, and like every choice, it carries weight. An existential weight that often tries to disguise itself as self-sufficiency, but which, in truth, betrays an inability to sustain the other's gaze, and one's own. Let us together explore this hidden weakness, not to condemn anyone, but to recognize in every silent gesture an opportunity for self-knowledge. Because the other's indifference need not be a sentence. It can be a mirror. And the most important question is not why does he ignore me, but who am I facing this silence? Sartre reminds us that the human being has no predefined essence. We are what we choose to be, and we are also what we choose to avoid. Ignoring is a kind of escape, and every escape carries within it fear, the fear of seeing, the fear of feeling, the fear of existing authentically. So when someone ignores you, do not see this merely as rejection. See it as revelation. Their silence speaks. It speaks of how hard it is for them to face not you, but themselves reflected in you. And that is what we will explore here. The weakness of the one who ignores lies not in the absence of words, but in the absence of courage. The courage to see themselves. There comes a moment when you are looked at, and suddenly everything changes. You cease to be just a body occupying space and become an object in someone's consciousness. Someone who observes you, who defines you, who projects intentions, values, judgments onto you. This is the power of the other's gaze, and it is also one of the greatest triggers of the shame of existing. Jean-Paul Sartre said that, "The gaze of the other makes me see what I cannot see in myself." Because alone you may believe you are free, that you are complete, that you are master of your own existence, but all it takes is someone's gaze to remind you that you are also an image, that you exist outwardly, that you are perceived, interpreted, defined, and not always in the way you would like. Now imagine the one who chooses to ignore you. He is not merely refusing your presence, he is refusing your gaze upon him, because to be looked at is to be exposed. It is to run the risk of being seen in one's vulnerability, one's contradictions, one's fears. Ignoring is then a way of hiding, of extinguishing the light you shine on him. It is as if, by avoiding your eyes, he tries to nullify his own consciousness. As if to say, if I do not see, I am not seen. A comforting illusion, but profoundly fragile. Because once the other exists, he is already part of your reality. And the effort to erase him is, in truth, the effort to erase a part of yourself. Think of someone who walked away from you without explanation, who left messages into the void, meetings halfway, stories without an ending. You may have asked yourself, what did I do wrong? But perhaps the question is another. Perhaps what you revealed, even unintentionally, was unbearable for him. And not because it was something bad, but because it was something too real, too alive, too human. There is a brutal discomfort in being seen authentically, in being recognized not by the mask, but by the bare face. And many prefer absence to the risk of transparency. They prefer silence to truth, because the truth of the other's gaze dismantles us, and not everyone is ready to see themselves dismantled. The shame of existing is born when the other reveals what we try to hide, and the one who ignores is often the one who most fears being unmasked. He feigns indifference, but behind that facade lurks the dread of being discovered. Discovered as someone fragile, insecure, contradictory, in other words, as someone profoundly human. So next time someone ignores you, don't see it as true indifference. See it as a protective move, a shield against the mirror you represent. Because sometimes what frightens most in the other is not what they do to us, but what they show us about who we are, and about who we are trying not to be. Ignoring someone may seem a simple choice, a gesture of control, a sign of emotional strength. But existentialism, as Sartre offers us, provides a deeper, more unsettling reading. Ignoring often is an act of bad faith. And bad faith, in this context, does not mean lying to others. It means lying to oneself. Bad faith is the mechanism by which the human being tries to escape from his freedom. It is when we pretend we have no choice, that we are merely victims of circumstances, that we are trapped in a role. It is when we deny our responsibility for being who we are. And to ignore someone can be exactly that, a way of denying one's role in the relationship, one's own impact, one's own humanity. Imagine someone who chooses to distance themselves from you without explanation, who falls silent in the face of conflict, who avoids any form of encounter. He may convince himself that he is merely being mature, grounded, indifferent. But what he is often doing is avoiding looking inward, avoiding perceiving that the other, you, provokes him, displaces him, demands him, that your presence calls him to the responsibility of responding, of taking a stand, of existing fully. Instead, he escapes and constructs for himself a comfortable narrative. I have no time. It doesn't affect me. I have already moved on. But these phrases, when repeated too often, cease to be truths and become excuses. They become masks. And behind the mask is someone who feels, someone who perhaps still cares, but who is afraid to admit it, because admitting it would be to acknowledge one's own vulnerability. Bad faith is an invisible prison. It is the place where the human being hides to avoid dealing with the burden of freedom. Sartre said that we are free even to reject that freedom. And it is exactly that which many do when they ignore someone. They refuse the freedom to feel. They refuse the freedom to open up to the other. They refuse the freedom to be affected. But there is a price for that refusal. The price is inauthenticity, the loss of self. Because when you ignore someone to avoid feeling, you also distance yourself from the part of you that is still alive, that still beats, that still desires. You cannot ignore the other without also ignoring a part of yourself. Bad faith disguised as indifference is, at heart, an emotional amputation, a denial of one's own complexity. So, when you realize you are being ignored, do not feel inferior. Ask yourself, what is this person trying to avoid in himself by erasing me? What is there in me that reveals what he does not want to see? And more, might it be that, at some point, you also do this to others? That by fleeing certain conversations, certain encounters, you are also practicing your own form of bad faith? This is the existential provocation. It is not enough to understand the other. You must also look at yourself, for bad faith is universal. All of us, at some level, try to flee from freedom. But it is only when we recognize this that we can begin to live more authentically. The human being, said Sartre, is condemned to be free. This phrase, at first glance, sounds like a paradox, like something that should be a cause for celebration. Freedom becomes a condemnation. The answer lies in responsibility. To be free means nothing completely determines us. There is no essence, no destiny, no manual, only choices. And each choice is a burden, because by choosing, we choose for ourselves, and in a way for the world. The responsibility of existing frightens, and that is why many flee from it. And this flight can take subtle forms, masked by rationality, by maturity, by self-sufficiency. Ignoring someone, for example, may seem a gesture of protection, of healthy boundary. But sometimes it is pure evasion. It is the refusal to assume one's participation in a relationship, in an affection, in a conflict. When someone ignores the other, he is silently saying, I do not want to deal with what this person provokes in me. It is an attempt to cut the thread of responsibility, to say, that is not my problem, but it is. Because every relationship is co-constructed, and even silence is a response. Even absence communicates. Even flight has consequences. Think of an everyday example. A person who, after an argument, simply disappears, does not reply to messages, avoids meetings, pretends nothing happened. He may justify himself by saying he needs time, that he does not want to feed conflicts. But often this absence is just fear. Fear of facing what he said, what he did, what he felt. Fear of having to answer, of having to reconsider himself, of having to change. The flight from responsibility is, therefore, the attempt to be an object, to act as if there were no consciousness, as if one were merely passive before life. But that is impossible. The human being is always consciousness, always in relation, even when he denies it. And there is another important aspect. The one who ignores the other is also fleeing from his own responsibility to transform. Because the other's gaze, as we have seen, reveals us, unsettles us, challenges us, and sometimes it is easier to avoid that gaze than to accept it as an invitation to change. Responsibility, then, is not only about answering to the other, it is answering to oneself. It is saying, I exist, and that has consequences. And this is where many fail, because the freedom to exist is an abyss, and not everyone is ready to look into that abyss without hiding behind silence. But there is a crucial detail. The flight from responsibility is not an exit. It is a temporary suspension, because sooner or later reality demands payment. What was avoided returns. Silence turns into internal noise. Absence becomes a weight, and that which was ignored exacts its price, not from the other but from the one who fled. Assuming responsibility, on the other hand, is not simple. It is painful. It is uncomfortable. But it is the only possible path to authenticity, to live without masks, to build real relationships. So when someone ignores you, do not see it as the end. See it as the point, where the other decided to stop taking responsibility. And even more importantly, ask yourself, where are you fleeing from your own responsibility? Because recognizing the flight is the first step to returning to the path. You may pretend someone does not exist. You may leave messages unanswered, ignore presences, walk past a gaze. You may even convince yourself that that person no longer matters. But there is a simple, raw, inescapable truth. Once you have been affected by someone, that person already lives in you. Jean-Paul Sartre affirmed that the other is an inevitable dimension of our existence. There is no escaping the other without escaping yourself, because consciousness does not form in a vacuum. It forms in friction, in confrontation, in the mirror that the other represents. Ignoring someone is therefore an attempt to erase that mirror. But the reflection has already happened. It has already marked. It has already contaminated. Even the attempt at indifference is itself a form of relation. It is what Sartre called negative relation. When someone emphatically ignores you, he paradoxically places you at the center of his consciousness. He turns you into something that needs to be denied. And denial demands effort, demands attention, demands memory. True indifference, if it exists, does not manifest so rigorously. It does not require explicit absence, because what does not affect us simply disappears. But when someone chooses to ignore you, that gesture is already an acknowledgement that you matter, perhaps more than he would like to admit. Imagine someone who avoids the places where you are, who crosses the street, who pretends not to see, who falls silent precisely when there is something to be said. This is not absence. It is presence denied. And every denial reinforces what it tries to erase. By nature, we are permeable beings. Everything we touch transforms us. Everything that touches us leaves marks. And ignoring someone does not undo those marks. It only covers them. But they remain as subtle scars, as shadows at the bottom of consciousness. More than that, ignoring someone is a futile attempt to be a being in itself, as Sartre said. A closed, complete object, untouched. But human beings are not like that. We are being for itself. We are always under construction, always in relation, always in movement. To try to be immune to the other is to try to be a stone. an object, a datum. But we are not that. We are consciousness. And consciousness, by definition, occurs in the world, with others, through others. The weakness of the one who ignores you lies not only in the flight from responsibility, it also lies in the refusal to accept that he has already been affected, that he has already been touched, that he has already carried you in memory, in desire, in anger, in pain. And by trying to erase that, he only reinforces your existence within him. You have already lived in the mind of the one who tries to forget you. You have already inhabited the silence he tries to maintain. And this is not vanity. It is human reality. So, do not be deceived by the gesture of indifference. It does not mean absence of affection. Often, it means excess. Excess of poorly processed feeling. Excess of unresolved conflict. Excess of self. And when you understand this, you no longer need to beg for presence, because you have already been there, and the one who tries to be immune to you is, in truth, bound to you even more deeply. There is a silent cost to living while denying what one feels, to ignoring the other, the affections, the conflicts, and above all, oneself. That cost does not appear immediately. It does not shout. It does not demand explanations. It accumulates slowly, like dust under the rug of consciousness, and one day it suffocates. Sartre reminds us that bad faith is not just an ethical error. It is a form of existential mutilation. When someone chooses to live in inauthenticity, pretending he does not feel, that he is unaffected, that he is superior or indifferent, he disconnects from his own freedom. He becomes a character in his own life instead of its author. Inauthenticity has many faces. It can be the successful professional who ignores the human ties lost along the way. It can be the lover who pretends to feel nothing after a breakup. It can be the friend who disappears and then acts as if no bond ever existed. In all these cases, there is an attempt to preserve an image, to maintain an identity that seems secure, invulnerable, controlled. But that security is illusory, because living without facing one's own affections is living at war with oneself. Those who ignore the other to maintain a facade of strength do not perceive that they are, little by little, erasing their own capacity to feel. And the further they distance themselves from affections, the emptier they become inside. Authenticity, on the other hand, demands courage. The courage to admit that something or someone has touched us. The courage to deal with the complexity of feelings. The courage not to have all the answers ready. And that is frightening, because to be authentic is to walk without armor. But inauthenticity exacts its price precisely in silence, in diffuse discomfort, in insomnia, in the repetition of patterns that seem inexplicable. Those who live erasing the past with new beginnings that never go deep are trapped in a surface that supports nothing. It is an emptiness that requires constant distractions not to be felt. The greatest problem of ignoring the other is not the harm one causes the other, but what one destroys within oneself, because every act of denial is also a renunciation of the possibility of transformation. And as Sartre says, the human being is a project. We are not a finished thing. We are a coming to be, a constant construction. And if we deny encounters, affections, conflicts, we lose precisely the raw materials of our construction. Those who pretend to feel nothing, who claim they were not touched, who believe they are above pain or desire, live as if they are already complete, as if nothing more can be added or removed. And that is the symbolic death of freedom, because freedom only lives where there is risk, where there is surrender, where there is truth. The price of inauthenticity is disconnection, first from others, then from oneself, and finally from life itself. Because living pretending is a slow way of ceasing to exist. So, if you have been ignored, understand. Perhaps the other is paying that price without knowing it. And if at some point you yourself have ignored someone who touched you, you may also have felt that emptiness. But the good news is that authenticity can be reclaimed at any moment. You just have to stop fleeing. You just have to start telling the truth, not to others, but to yourself. There is a moment, inevitable, when you need to choose, to keep trying to be seen by one who ignores you, or to begin to see yourself with the radical honesty and respect you deserve. This choice is the threshold between dependence and freedom, between reaction and creation. Because when someone ignores you, the pain that arises does not come solely from the other's absence, but from the void that reveals itself within you. This pain is an invitation, a call to look within and ask, what did that person represent to me? Which part of me hides behind the need to be recognized? And perhaps the most difficult question, what prevents me from being whole without the other's gaze? Existentialism teaches us that the other is always a mirror, but that the reflection is not everything. The other's gaze can indeed reveal, but it should not determine. When you are ignored, you have the chance to break that cycle, to stop living as someone who depends on external validation and begin to build a relationship with yourself that needs no audience. Transforming ignorance into self-knowledge requires ceasing to interpret silence as rejection and beginning to see it as revelation. What hurts when someone does not respond? What pulses when you feel absence? Is it lack? Is it bruised pride? Is it fear of not existing unless seen? These are questions that cannot be answered with logic, but with presence. Being present for yourself, even when the other absents himself. Writing down what you feel, remaining silent, and listening to what emerges. Not to protect yourself, but to find yourself. Practice honesty with yourself. List the names of the people who impacted you most. Not only those who loved you, but also those who ignored you. What did each reveal about you? Which versions of yourself did you attempt to be in order to be accepted? And what would remain if you stopped trying? Self-knowledge is not empty introspection. It is action. It is looking at the pain of being ignored and using it as raw material for reconstructing your own autonomy. It is stepping out of the victim role and assuming the protagonism of your own meaning. Because there is something liberating in ceasing to wait for answers. When you stop begging for presence, you begin to discover your own. When you abandon the hope of being noticed, you begin to see everything that was hidden behind that need. And perhaps, in this process, you will discover something surprising, that the other's silence is merely a space, and that within that space, there is room for you to grow, to assert yourself, to remake yourself, not as a reaction to the other, but as your own choice. One who truly knows himself is not defined by what the other gives or denies. He is defined by what he chooses to be, despite the other. And that is freedom, the most difficult, the most painful, but also the most real. You have come this far. That says a great deal. It means that, at some level, you have decided not to ignore yourself any longer. You have decided to face discomfort, silence, absence, and make it a starting point, not a stopping point. On this journey, we have seen that when someone ignores you, that gesture reveals more about him than about you. It reveals an internal conflict, a refusal of responsibility, a deep fear of the freedom the other represents. Ignoring is not strength. It is flight. It is bad faith, disguised as control. It is a desperate attempt to remain untouched in a world where everything touches us, everything reveals us. We understand that no one is immune to the other. That silence also speaks. That the attempt to erase someone is often a confession of impact, and that the price of inauthenticity is far too high to be sustained for long. But the most important point of this journey is not the other. It is you. What will you do with all this? Will you continue seeking recognition from one who decided not to see you? Or will you begin to recognize yourself with the depth and respect you deserve? Sartre said that we are not what they make of us, but what we make of what they have made of us. That is the turning point. You can take the experience of being ignored and transform it into self-compassion, into lucidity, into creative strength. You can stop being the echo of the other's silence and become the voice that chooses its own path. Assuming your own freedom is a radical gesture. It is saying, even if no one sees me, I choose to see myself. Even if the other flees, I choose to remain with myself. Even if there are no guarantees, I choose to exist. This is the courage to exist fully. The courage not to depend anymore on what you lack, but to nourish yourself on what you already are. The courage to be presence, even when everything around seems absence. So now, one last question. Who do you choose to be from this silence onward? Will you continue seeking explanations, justifications, reactions, or will you use this void as fertile ground to create a version more honest, more whole, more yours? The answer is not in the words you still hope to hear. It is in the silence you decide to occupy. It is in the daily choice to be who you are despite everything. And it is there that freedom reveals itself, not as a burden, but as a rebirth. Choose who you want to be today, not tomorrow, not when you are noticed, not when you are understood, but now. Because being ignored is not the end, it is sometimes the best beginning.